Today, I want to talk about some of the things that I disagree with Rand on. Ayn Rand, being the greatest philosopher of all time, as we know, had a few oopsies, shall we say. But I'm going to start off light. I'm going to start off tame, and I'm going to start off with something that really isn't that bad. So, for example, on page 52 of The Virtue of Selfishness, which I have the 50th anniversary here, the 50th anniversary one with me, she talks about here in the chapter of the ethics of emergencies. Quote, if the person to be saved is not a stranger, then the risk one should be willing to take is greater in proportion to the greatness of that person's value to oneself. If it is the man or woman one loves, then one can be willing to give one's own life to save him or her, for the selfish reason that life without the loved person could be unbearable. Now, I agree I don't okay, I was about to say I agree in theory but not in practice, but that's a theory practice dichotomy and that's false. It's not a good theory. It on the surface it may sound good, but she is forgetting one crucial part, and I wrote down like physically in my book what I thought about this. And so I wrote down but I would say the conclusion that life would be unbearable is an irrational conclusion. Basically what Rand is getting at is that sometimes it's okay to sacrifice yourself to your loved one if you conclude or if you evaluate that there are no rational means without them in life, that life is not worth living if that person dies. But have we ever considered, is such a thing rational? Is such a thing even possible? Why is there no more rational means if your loved one dies and it's worth giving up your life for their life? Second, how can you be the beneficiary of an action if you die for that action? It does not make sense. Like, to be selfish, you have to be the beneficiary of the action. How can you be the beneficiary if you're dead? So I disagree with Rand on this. This one is not that bad. Her takes goes like, it takes a steep dive from here. Let me show you the despotism of the Randian state. So, check this out. Page 120 of The Virtue of Selfishness in the chapter Collectivize quote unquote rights, where Rand tries to debunk collectivize group ownership rights, but ironically advocates for group ownership rights in the process. So, notice right here on page 120, a nation, like any other group, is only a number of individuals and can have no rights other than the rights of its individual citizens. Now, I like where this is going, but I also don't like how this is going. Cuz at one side of it, it sounds like the nation doesn't have rights, only individuals have rights. But the way that this sentence on this paragraph is phrased is saying that the nation does have rights, but it's only the rights of its individual citizens, which is going to be confusing later on because, like, following what Rand just said right there, quote, a free nation, a nation that recognizes, respects, and protects the individual rights of its citizens, has a right to its territorial integrity, its social system, and its form of government. Wait a minute. A nation has a right? Isn't this collectivized rights? This is group ownership. The nation cannot have a right because the group doesn't act. Groups don't act. This is basic methodological individualism. And Rand is an individualist, so she is supposed to be upholding methodological individualism, which is the stance that only individuals act. And following from that, only individuals have rights, not groups. But here she is saying that the nation has a right. Stop, shut up, Rand. Don't, whatever you're going to say after that, you've already fallen into a fallacy that a nation can have rights, which leads to her atrocious foreign policies, both her and the General Randians. For example, on page 122, she says, any free nation has the right to invade Nazi Germany and today has the right to invade Soviet Russia, Cuba, or any other slave pen. No. I wrote down physically in the notes in this book. I physically wrote down first. This is quoting me. I'm like, this is what I wrote down. First, I smell war taxes. Second, nations have rights now. The point of war is to expand the state's subjugations of humans and territory. Okay? It is not freeing and liberating one country from tyranny. It's simply swapping out tyranny for other tyranny, and it leads a path of destruction in its wake. That is the product of war. And to insinuate that levying taxes for military expansion is in any way aligned with the objectivist principles um is ludicrous. And it's one of those things where you think about, can we really call Ayn Rand a full-on objectivist? I don't know. Was she merely drifting on this information? Was she merely drifting on this? Or was she evading for some sort of glorified uh worship of the United States? But, you know, this is not the worst of it. It gets worse. Buckle in. Actually, before we do that, I just turned the page and I found some of my own past notes that I thought was good to mention here. I said, let's see. Nothing is right about raising taxes, and war is never one-on-one, state v state. It's always murderers and innocent lives taken. Um, so the point that I'm trying to make here is not that we have the good guy state versus the bad guy state, and one is the aggressor and one is the non-aggressor. No, 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 no. Because states don't act. The states are just groups of criminals. And so you have just masses of murderers murdering other masses of murderers with innocent people in the crossfire. And this is where if you neglect methodological individualism, you get terrible fallacious ideas that nations have rights. Okay, I'm not pressing this any further. Let's move on to something even more egregious. All right, now moving on to the chapter called The Nature of Government, page 127. I quote, "The use of physical force, even if it's retaliatory use, cannot be left at the discretion of individual citizens." What the fuck? Excuse me? Individual citizens do not have self-defense rights? I go on. "Peaceful coexistence is impossible if a man has to live under the constant threat of force to be unleashed against him by any of his neighbors at any moment." Well, that's a fucking non sequitur. That literally came out of nowhere. We went from if people have self-defense rights, then we will have waging conflicts with neighbors all the time. What? Whether his neighbors, I go on to quote, by the way, "Whether his neighbors' intentions are good or bad, whether their judgment is rational or irrational, whether they are motivated by a sense of justice or by ignorance or by prejudice or by malice, the use of force against one man cannot be left to the arbitrary decision of another." So she equates the right to self-defense to it being arbitrary. What? Oh, how can she is flat out denying the right to self-defense because any use of retaliatory force, she says it right here, quote, "even if it's retaliatory use, is arbitrary." Arbitrary being not in relation to reality. What the fuck? Huh? Ayn Rand, you're supposed to be upholding individual rights, and here you are denying it, and that these rights have to be defended by the government. Oh, man. So, let me go on. Quote, "Visualize, for example, what would happen if a man missed his wallet, concluded that he had been robbed, broke into every house in the neighborhood to search it, and shot the first man who gave him a dirty look, taking the look to be a proof of guilt." Unquote. Is that really what you think self-defense is, Rand? No, that's not self-defense. I don't even have to explain myself how that's just flat out irrational brute aggression, even if the guy had good intent. Clearly this guy is mentally retarded in this hypothetical. So, but like let's take the reductio ad absurdum here. Um to take Rand's principle to the extreme. If a woman is getting raped, let's say, if a woman is getting brutally raped, she has no right to self-defense because it could be arbitrary. It sounds like Rand right here is a skeptic. It sounds like she's a Cartesian doubter. It is actually like just super sad reading this because Rand is like the most important philosopher of all time. Okay, let's move on. Quote, the retaliatory use of force requires objective rules, and I highlighted under this saying, yes, of course it requires objective rules. As a Rothbardian, the objective rule is the non-aggression principle. So, anyways, moving on. Requires objective rules of evidence to establish that a crime has been committed and to prove who committed it, as well as objective rules to define punishments and enforcement procedures. Men who attempt to prosecute crimes without such rules are a lynch mob. So far, I agree. This is not inconsistent with the non-aggression principle. In fact, it is absolutely consistent with the non-aggression principle, with Rothbardian law. Quote, if a society left the retaliatory use of force in the hands of individual citizens, it would degenerate into a mob rule, lynch law, and an endless series of bloody private feuds or vendettas. Again, non sequitur. First off, she is making a dichotomy between individual citizens and the state. But this props up the state as supernatural compared to individual citizens. That the state somehow is almighty, all good, all knowing, and is way better than these puny peasant citizens. No, we're all humans. Why does this politician of all people get to be a better person than your average person? You really want politicians to be the deciding factor on what is right and wrong. In fact, this is straight up a primacy of consciousness fallacy to say that the objective rules is going to be decided by the state instead of up to objective reality. It is, and she really just equates any form of private retaliatory use as mob rule, lynch law, and endless series of bloody private feuds. She never substantiates this. All she does is she just says non sequitur hypotheticals. That's it. It's very, very weak, and it makes you wonder. This is just patchwork evasion on her part to cover her ass up from the Rothbardian anarchists at the time. It really makes me mad because it really makes me consider she was not an objectivist all the way up to, she was an objectivist all the way up until politics or law. And at that point she dropped off. Like there's no way that she wrote this out, sat down and thought, yep, this looks like a coherent argument, and printed it into one of her most popular nonfiction books of all time. I don't buy it. I legitimately do not buy it. She's either off her marbles or she is evading on the fact. So, anyways, I'm going to continue on with this. Let's see. If physical force is to be barred from social relationships, men need an institution charged with the task of protecting their rights under an objective code of rules. Just the sentence alone, if physical force is to be barred from social relationships. It's basically saying, if self-defense is to be revoked from everybody, we need an almighty state to be the ones to protect you. What the fuck? This is despotic as shit. And I'm going to skip a few. I'm going to skip to like 2 pages later on page 129. I quote, this shit hurts me to the soul. Get ready for this one. Page 129, quote, there is only one basic principle to which an individual must consent if he wishes to live in a free, civilized society. The principle of renouncing the use of physical force and delegating to the government his right of physical self-defense for the purpose of an orderly, objective, legally defined enforcement. Or to put it another way, he must accept the separation of force and whim. Whoa. You know what this sounds like? This sounds like when Emperor Palpatine in the prequels was like I'm gonna establish the Empire for a free and ordered civilized society. Rand is straight up just saying, submit to the fucking state, submit your rights to the state, lay down and die. What the fuck? I'm getting worked up all over again. Like, I didn't read this passage. Like, the last time I read this passage was probably like a month or less than a month ago. And I'm just getting all worked up all over again. Because it's so infuriating that I have to hear this from Ayn Rand. Just makes me sad. Someone's knocking at my door. What do you want? On page 131, I quote, and I'm taking a second take of this, and I'm mad because my first audio was corrupted. Moving on, a recent variant of the anarchistic theory, which is befuddling some of the younger advocates of freedom, is a weird absurdity called competing governments, accepting the basic premise of the modern statists, who see no difference between the functions of government and the functions of industry, between force and production, and who advocate government ownership of business. The proponents of competing governments take the other side of the same coin and declare that since competition is so beneficial to business, it should be also applied to government. End of quote. So the fallacy here is that us anarchists, us Rothbardians, and I know she's addressing us because she says right here a recent variant of anarchistic theory, and I know that she is referring to the Rothbardians at this time, that we don't advocate for competing governments. We advocate for no government. So that should be really obvious right off the bat. And so we're not applying the theory of business and competition to government because we just don't want any government. And she goes on to say basically that you can't have competing governments because you have conflicting claims on law. The problem is that Rothbardians only agree on one law, one objective law, and to say that what we advocate is for competing law is a fallacy, which has been confused by David Friedman, who claims to be an anarcho-capitalist and claims that he thinks that law is subjective and that law should be decided upon the private arbiters of a free society. He confuses what anarcho-capitalism is about. It's about the non-aggression principle. It's about the initiation of force or threats, or the initiation of conflict is wrong. Whether an arbiter in a free society decides with an aggressor or not does not make the right, or does not make the ruling of the private arbiter any more right. And then basically right here, she talks about a hypothetical of two competing governments. Quote, Mr. Jones, a customer sorry, let me restart. A quote, one illustration would be sufficient. Suppose Mr. Smith, a customer of Government A, suspects that his next-door neighbor, Mr. Jones, a customer of Government B, has robbed him. A squad of police A proceeds to Mr. Jones' house and is met at the door by a squad of police B, who declare that they do not accept the validity of Mr. Smith's complaint and do not recognize the authority of Government A. What happens then? You take it from there. I can probably make a whole separate video on how private arbitration and security would work in a free society. But just ignoring the economics of it, let's just look at how this example is at face value. Why is this hypothetical why does this hypothetical not apply to the Randian state in Rand's hypothetical perfect state? What if her state and a different state have competing claims? What happens then? You take it from there, Rand. Just because people get into conflicts does not neglect law, does not neglect the objectivity of ethics. I feel like Rand, out of all people, would know that better. we're assuming a free society here. So we should be assuming that this society is a rational society, an objectivist society. So we're already in an established society where most people are rational. Because how do you get from A to B? How do you get from our irrational society to a rational society without making the majority of people rational and for them to conform to the philosophy of objectivism? So it does not make any sense why, okay, we live in a free society and we have reached the philosophy of the day being objectivism, but also people are irrational and they cannot decide for themselves and they cannot work out issues by themselves, and we need daddy government to come in and intervene and fix their issues for them because they're just everybody's brute and irrational. Why are we assuming this? Why can't we assume that the free market will work itself out when literally objectivists agree that free market capitalism is the best economic system to have? So why are they agreeing with that all the way up until private arbitration? Why do they want a socialism on private arbitration? That they want everything to be like capitalism except for the market of arbitration, and that should be monopolized by the state. It just doesn't make any sense. And I know I'm leaving out a bunch of things here. I'm leaving out like how would this system work in a free society? There's resources for you to look at. For example, you can look at the chapters dealing with that in Murray Rothbard's book For a New Liberty if you want to start in that. And I can make my own video specifically addressing about how private arbitration in a free society would work. But it's just super disingenuous. Like, what happens then? You take it from there. Um, you just set up a scenario and pretend that there's no solution. But that's not an argument. Anyways, it's just Rand thinks that our position is competing laws. It's not competing law. It's only one law. The non-aggression principle is the objective law. And what is the best system to uphold the non-aggression principle? Free market. Free market all the way from bread to arbitration. All right, to cap this off, I'm going to read from my notes that I wrote down here when I was reading this passage for the first time. Quote from me: "Law is objective. Law isn't up to any arbiter, including the state. It just so happens that right enforcement is provided way better by the free market. Again, read Rothbard on that. The state is a gang of criminals. They can never properly arbitrate." So I think Past Me properly capped that off. So, to cap this off, I quote page 137. "Any program of voluntary government financing is the last, not the first, step on the road to a free society. The last, not the first, reform to advocate. It would work only when the basic principles and institutions of a free society have been established. It would not work today." And later on in that page, I quote further, "A gradual process is required, and any program of voluntary government financing has to be regarded as a goal for a distant future." So here is Rand saying that the abolishment of taxation is the goal, but not right now. As in, we have to wait for whatever reason. For whatever reason that she thinks it would not work today. Well, ignoring the economics behind the egregious economics behind that, taxation is theft. If your goal is to abolish taxation because you think taxation is theft, then why would you purposefully wait for that goal to be abolished? Why would you want taxation to go on? Why this is so arbitrary? It's so like, how long should we wait? 5 years? 10 years? Why do we have to wait at all? Theft is theft. Theft is wrong. And I don't really have to argue on that point that much further because that one is just so obviously wrong and she does not even provide an argument for it. Her argument is just, it would not work today. Why? What? You sound like a Heraclitean. You sound like, oh, it may be true for tomorrow, but it's not true today. It may have been true in the past, but it's not true today. It literally sounds like a Heraclitean. Every take that I've talked about today about Rand is egregiously, and so obviously against objectivism. It astounds me that all these Randians follow her word like gospel. They don't have no critical thinking at all. These Randians have no critical thinking to say that, like, oh yeah, you know what? Taxation for right now, that's a good thing. Theft, aggression right now, we should end it later, but for now, that's okay. What? It makes no sense. If your principle is that theft and aggression is wrong, then your principle is theft and aggression right now is wrong, not 9 months later, or 5 years later, or 10 years later. Makes no goddamn sense. Makes no sense. So, in conclusion, the Randian state is give up your rights to self-defense, submit to the state. Also, socialism works for arbitration. Socialism for everything else doesn't work, but we decide, as in the state, we decide that you need us to take care private arbitration for you, and we need to abolish private arbitration, and we need to be the ultimate arbiters on what is objective law. You don't know what objective law is. Only we, the almighty state, knows what objective law is. And you puny citizens, you can't work out your issues together like adults. You guys are all children. We, the state, we're the ultimate adult. Yep, Rand was kind of cringe, to say the least. But besides that, the philosophy of objectivism, and this book in particular, The Virtue of Selfishness, phenomenal book. And, I'm really playing up a negative perspective, a pessimistic perspective. But that's only because I'm doing this video out of love. I'm only doing this video because I really love Ayn Rand and what she had to say on 99% of other issues. Now, I personally have not done enough research on Ayn Rand's position on intellectual property. However, I know that she was in favor of intellectual property. Also, Murray Rothbard was in favor of a form of intellectual property too, but that could be a video for a different time because his justification for his form of intellectual property laid out in The Ethics of Liberty is an interesting case, and I might just want to do a separate video on that. And besides the point, I have not read up on what Rand, like how Rand justifies intellectual property. However, I know that intellectual property is false. The thing about intellectual property is that you cannot own an idea because you can only own individual scarce means, scarce resources, only goods, only things that you can have conflict over. Conflict being dispute over scarce means. And to the idea to that you can own an idea is ludicrous. So imagine this. Imagine if I was a painter and I own the materials that I use as a means to paint, such as a canvas. And let's say I wanted to make an exact copy of the Mona Lisa and sell that. Well, under intellectual property rights, quote unquote rights, I'm not allowed to sell the Mona Lisa. Even though the canvas and the paint on the canvas and the things that I made, and I made the painting myself, is my property. Therefore, I have the right to transfer ownership to whoever is a willing buyer of my painting, even if it is an exact copy of the Mona Lisa. That's because intellectual property is based on the idea, no, you can't copy someone else's work and sell it because copying someone else is stealing their idea. You can't literally steal an idea. You can have an idea in your head, and I can have an idea in my head, and we can both have the same idea in our heads, and we can't have a conflict over it. Therefore, there's the issue of rights does not apply to ideas. So the following is my response to Dr. Peikoff, who was Ayn Rand's heir, and he was the one who founded the Ayn Rand Institute. This is in response to Peikoff's justification of the state. and I'm pretty sure that Ayn Rand uses the same justification. And I'm specifically citing Peikoff's 1976 lecture series on him going over all of objectivism. And I know that he also restates the same thing in Opar. I'm almost finished with Opar myself. Opar is Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. It's just a shorthand way of saying that book title. Anyways, I'm just gonna read what I wrote down already. I'll put the timestamp on the screen for you guys and the link to the specific lecture that Peikoff was giving. So, quote, by its nature, government has a monopoly on the use of force. In a rational society, individuals agree to delegate their right of self-defense. They renounce the private use of physical force, even in self-protection, except during those emergencies that require action at once before the police can be summoned. But that's an interesting point. Let me stop the quote and address that. I heard this his exception. I remember this when I was reading Opar, that he made an exception like for giving the right to self-defense. Let me restart. Okay, so I'm going to repeat this sentence. Except during those emergencies that require action at once before the police can be summoned. Um, why are we delegating the right to self-defense only in the presence of police officers? Let me restart. Okay, I'm going to repeat this sentence one more time so I can emphasize it. Except during those emergencies that require action at once before the police can be summoned. This is stupid because you always have the right to self-defense. It's not like your right to self-defense magically appears because the police are not here yet. What if the police come and they're incapable of saving you? But they're here, they're summoned, therefore you don't have the right to self-defense, so you just gotta wait for them to do their job, but they're doing their job poorly. It doesn't make any sense. Why do we lose the right to self-defense when there's a police officer present? It's stupid. It is a stupid cover-up that Peikoff made to cover Ayn Rand's ass because Ayn Rand said a stupid thing and Peikoff was trying to salvage it. So, anyways, continuing on with the quote. If a society is to uphold man's rights, such delegation is essential. No, it isn't. If men did not delegate the task of self-defense to a central agency, every individual will have to live and work armed, ready to shoot any stranger who looks suspicious. It's the same thing. Peikoff just parrots whatever Ayn Rand says with no critical thinking whatsoever. I mean, it's completely a straw man on our position, which I guess our position is for self-defense. Why the fuck is Ayn Rand and Peikoff against self-defense as a right? And why is this their argument? Why is the argument that, oh, if we had the right to self-defense, then everyone would shoot each other? What the fuck? it's just, it's just, it's just an absolute straw man for no reason. Like, I don't get why is Peikoff defending this? Why is Ayn Rand defending this? I don't know why they would defend such a thing, other than this is their best argument against anarchism. And then why are they so against anarchism? And also, how the way that Peikoff defines anarchism in Opar is really, really stupid because he basically defines anarchism as lawless chaos. No, anarchism is not the philosophy of lawless chaos. It is the philosophy that the state is the institution of lawlessness and chaos. It is the complete antithesis to lawless and chaos. I'm not an anarchist because I want lawlessness and chaos. I'm an anarchist because I am against lawlessness and chaos. Specifically, the outlaws that call themselves the state. But I'm also against all forms of criminality. All outlaws. Especially the outlaw gang criminal mafia empire that is the state. Where was I? I forgot. I got sidetracked. Individual have to live. Yep. Okay. Or, much more likely, men would form packs to protect themselves from other similar packs, and the result would be gang wars and mob rule. Yada yada yada. In either case, peaceful coexistence amongst men would be impossible. Pretty weak foundation to justify that. Physical force is the power of destruction. A rational society cannot exist if a man is free to unleash such a threat against others as and when he chooses. This applies whatever the threatened knowledge and character, whether he is informed or ignorant, uh, judicious or rash, just or unjust. The use of force against one man, states Ayn Rand, cannot be left to the arbitrary decision of another. A society must remove the retaliatory use of force methodologically from the realm of whim. Every aspect of such use must be defined in advance, validated, codified. Under what conditions force can be employed, by whom, against whom, in what forms, to what extent. Which, by the way, the Rothbardians already laid that out infinitely better than the Randians. The Randians basically were like, don't initiate force, and that was the extent of their legal theory. Obviously, the Rothbardians were the true innovators on law. And it's really funny how in Opar, Peikoff regards anarchy as lawlessness and chaos. When he knows that Murray Rothbard and the Rothbardians exist, and they've developed an extensive systematic theory of law. I know this because it's funny because Peikoff in Opar um, cited the Austrian School of Economics as the best school of economics, which Murray Rothbard was obviously one of the big faces in Austrian economics, probably second to Ludwig von Mises himself. So he would have known about Murray Rothbard's theory of law. It's part of the tradition of Austrianism, and it's just completely ignored, never addressed. Anytime the Randian wants to debunk anarchism, they cite anarchism as lawless chaos, completely evading the theory of natural law and the non-aggression principle that Murray Rothbard and other Rothbardians have laid out. Oh, hey, you know what? I just realized I was reading the wrong quote. This is not the quote that I was meant to read. Oh well. Okay, here's the real quote from the lecture that I was talking about. Okay, this is Peikoff right here. Observe that the issue of rights arises and applies in a social context, and more specifically in connection with the formation of an organized social system. The man lives on a desert island. There was no question of anyone recognizing or infringing his rights. The issue wouldn't come up. Even if several men live on a desert island, if they have no organized social system, the issue would still not be applicable. There would be no one in such a case to implement the idea of rights. No courts, no police, no government. The issue of rights applies, in short, when men propose to live in an organized society and to implement certain principles of social relationships. In that context, the principle of rights say there are certain areas where each man must morally be left alone to act independently. End of quote. And now I'm quoting myself here. This is what I wrote down in response. Quote, me. This right here is where it all went wrong. While the libertarian theorist would agree here that Crusoe alone on an island does not give rise to the issue of rights, Peikoff makes the grave error of saying rights are no issue when man has to live amongst other men. He makes the mistake of saying implicitly that conflict and scarcity is not the problem law has to deal with, that rights are no issue here. Peikoff asserts that rights only come about when men come together and form a, quote, social organization, unquote. Implicitly, when the state forms, it is the assertion that rights only exist when politicians decree there shall be rights, that politicians' consciousness has primacy over existence. End of quote. So, past me couldn't have said it better than me right now. So I'm gonna move on. Oh wait, actually that was the end of the list of my complaints. So that's the end of the video, I guess. Have a beautiful whatever day it is that you're watching this video on. Bye-bye.